She had been on the wall since before the street lamps came on. That was what she would remember afterwards. Not Dumbledore's arrival with the child bundled against his chest, not Petunia Dursley's face in the doorway. She would remember the waiting, the long, ordinary evening of number 4, Privet Drive, the neighbors drawing their curtains and going in for their suppers, the sky shifting from orange to a flat suburban black, the cold of the stones seeping through 4 pores she would not have admitted were aching. She had waited because she needed to see for herself. That was all. She had needed to see. Dumbledore came at 10:30. She watched him materialize at the far end of the street. No crack of apparition, no flash, simply present where he had not been a moment before. His purple robes an absurdity against the dark, the child a small still weight in the crook of his arm. He walked without hurrying. She had never known him to hurry. He crossed the road, paused at the Dursleys' gate, and looked up at the house. And then, as though he had known she was there the entire time, he turned and looked at her. "Minerva," he said quietly. She did not answer. She was a cat, and cats did not answer to their names, regardless of what they actually were. He let this pass with the small, resigned patience he brought to most things, and he went up the front walk and rang the bell. Petunia Dursley opened the door before the sound of it had quite died. She had clearly been waiting. Her eyes went to the bundle in Dumbledore's arms, and something moved across her face that was not grief and not welcome, and was perhaps closest to a door closing in a room that had already been shut. "You'll have been told," Dumbledore said, not a question. A letter came. Her voice was thin and very controlled. She did not look at the child's face. "I know what you are going to say. Then you understand the nature of the protection. As long as Harry may call this house home, the charm holds. You are his blood. That is what makes it irreplaceable." "I know what it is," Petunia said. "I'm not ignorant." "No," Dumbledore said, and his voice carried something that might, in another register, have been apology. "You are not." There was a long moment. Then Petunia stepped back, and Dumbledore crossed the threshold with the child, and the door of number 4, Privet Drive, closed behind them both. She sat on the wall and waited. She heard, through the thin suburban walls, the murmur of voices, Dumbledore's measured cadences and Petunia's clipped, resentful syllables, rising occasionally and then subdued. She heard once the thin sound of an infant disturbed and resettled. The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then Dumbledore came back out alone, his hands empty. He paused at the gate. "He is sleeping," he said without turning. "She will manage." She regarded him from the wall with the absolute neutrality available to her current form. She managed just barely, not to say what she thought of that. Dumbledore looked at her then, and his expression was tired in a way she had not seen before tonight, not the comfortable weariness of a long evening, but something older, something that had worn grooves. "You will not convince me that there is a safer arrangement," he said. "I know what I am asking of him. I know what I am asking of them. I have weighed it." She said nothing. He was not wrong about the blood magic, and he knew it, and she knew it, and that was the most infuriating thing about the entire evening. He left. She stayed. The night was cold, and the street was quiet. In the house, lights went off room by room. The living room, an upstairs bedroom, a bathroom briefly illuminated, then dark. The last to go was a small light near the back of the house. Then number 4 was entirely dark, and she dropped silently from the wall into the garden. She found a position in the shrubbery along the front of the house and waited. Harry cried twice in the night. The first time, the crying went on for several minutes before she heard movement from upstairs, slow, reluctant footsteps, a door, and then silence, the specific quality of silence that followed feeding. The second time, perhaps an hour later, the footsteps came more quickly. She noted this. It was not nothing. By 1 o'clock, the household was quiet. Dudley Dursley stirred once, a brief, plaintive sound, and was not attended to, which told her something about the general hierarchy of attention, though not necessarily about Harry's particular position within it. She kept her observations as a cat must keep them, in the precise, cold register of the senses. No conclusions yet, only evidence. She did not sleep. She was very tired, and she did not sleep. Vernon Dursley left at 7:43 in the morning. He came out of the house in his suit and tie with the expression of a man sustaining enormous grievances with commendable fortitude, got into his car, and drove away without once looking back at the house. In the quarter hour since he had come downstairs, she had not heard him acknowledge the infant in his home, by word or action. She catalogued this. Petunia's morning was brisk and functional. She fed Harry at 8, porridge, spooned with the detached efficiency of someone completing a task from a list, and changed him on the kitchen table with the same economy of movement. Not unkind, precisely. Not tender either. Somewhere in the space between the two, and further from each than a mother ought to be. Then she carried him across the hallway and opened the cupboard under the stairs. It was small. That was the first thing. It was small and dark, and the underside of the staircase made its ceiling slope to almost nothing at the far end, and there was a cot in it. She could see the white frame from her position at the window, and Petunia set Harry in it and closed the door. Minerva McGonagall sat in the shrubbery of number 4, Privet Drive, and was very still. The cupboard was not a bedroom. The cupboard was a cupboard with a cot in it, which was not the same thing, and Harry Potter was 15 months old and sleeping in it now, in the dark, under the stairs. She stayed until mid-morning to be certain. Petunia moved through the kitchen making tea, then occupied herself elsewhere in the house. Harry slept. The cupboard door stayed closed. Then she made her decision. Not Dumbledore. He had weighed it, he'd said. He had weighed Harry's safety against Harry's circumstances, and he had chosen safety, and he was not entirely wrong, and he was not entirely right, and he would not be moved by her concern because he had answered it already to his own satisfaction. She knew him. She had known him for 40 years. He would listen with his full and luminous attention, and he would explain, patiently and with evident love for her, why she was mistaken, and she would leave the conversation feeling as though she had brought him a stone, and he had handed back a loaf of bread, and she could not quite account for the exchange. He had weighed it, and he would weigh it again for her benefit, and the child would remain in the dark. No, not Dumbledore. The Board of Governors retained formal oversight of Harry Potter's welfare as a prospective Hogwarts student. It was a thin authority, stretched across a decade not yet arrived, but it existed outside Dumbledore's own, and it was the only authority she had. She would write her report. She would document what she had seen. The cupboard, the indifference, the Dursleys' evident and profound wish that Harry Potter did not exist in their house, and she would put it before the board in formal language on record, where it could not be absorbed and gently explained away. She slipped out through the garden hedge and onto the pavement beyond, and she walked until the street was empty, and then she was herself again, and the cold of November went through her robes immediately. She stood in Little Whinging for a moment with the house still visible at the end of the road, a perfectly ordinary house on a perfectly ordinary street, and a child asleep in the dark inside it. She disapparated. She had her notes. She would write her report, and Albus Dumbledore would learn that weighing something carefully did not place it beyond question. She came back. That was the decision she had made, halfway across Little Whinging, standing in the cold, with her notes still forming themselves into sentences in her head, already aware that what she had observed was not enough. A morning, a cupboard. Petunia Dursley's face performing the arithmetic of care without any of its warmth. It was damning, and it was a single morning, and the Board of Governors, cautious, procedural, constitutionally reluctant to challenge an arrangement endorsed by Albus Dumbledore, would require more than a single morning. They would require a pattern. She disapparated to Hogwarts, retrieved her thickest robes, transformed, and apparated back to the alley behind the newsagents on Magnolia Road. Then she walked the 3 streets to Privet Drive and resumed her position in the shrubbery and settled in to observe. The rest of the day of November 1st, 1981 would have tested the patience of a less committed woman. As a cat, she had certain advantages. Cold registered differently. Boredom was partly metabolic, and the acute particularity of feline senses meant she could not drift into abstraction the way a human observer might. She noticed everything. That was the difficulty, as much as the comfort. She noticed everything, and everything she noticed compounded the morning's evidence into something harder and more systematic. Dudley Dursley's morning had been loud and happy. Petunia brought him downstairs at 9:30 and set him in a playpen in the living room that was large, padded, and stocked with toys, a set of brightly colored rings, 2 stuffed animals, a ball that made a sound when rolled. She spoke to him, Not at great length and not with any particular eloquence, but she spoke, the running commentary of mothers who narrate the world to their children before language exists to receive it. Here is your bunny. Can you see the bunny? Yes, you can. Dudley received this narration with enormous self-satisfaction, batting at his toys, occasionally emitting a sound of general contentment. Petunia looked at him with the specific softness that had been entirely absent from her face during Harry's morning feed. Harry, for the portion of the morning that followed, was quiet. The cupboard door stayed closed. She could not determine from her position whether he was sleeping or simply lying in the dark without making noise, and that uncertainty was itself data of a kind. He woke at 11:45. The crying began small, the thin preliminary cry of an infant still half asleep, and built over several minutes into something more insistent. Petunia was in the kitchen, making Dudley's lunch. She did not hurry. She completed her task, wiped her hands on a cloth, put the small bowl of something soft and orange on the tray of Dudley's high chair, and then she went to the cupboard and opened it. Harry's crying, freed from the closed space, was immediately louder. Petunia picked him up with competent hands and carried him to the kitchen, where she warmed a bottle and fed him standing at the counter with him propped against her shoulder, not cradled, not rocked, not spoken to. Dudley ate his lunch and banged a spoon against his tray and made observations in a language only he understood, and Petunia responded to these with sounds of encouragement while Harry drank his bottle in silence beside her ear. She returned him to the cupboard when the bottle was finished. She did not linger. By mid-afternoon, McGonagall had seen enough to understand the shape of things. It was not violence. It was not starvation. The Dursleys would not actively harm Harry Potter. She had watched Petunia's hands through enough interactions to know that the practical care was adequate, meeting some essential minimum of which Petunia was rigorously aware. But beneath adequacy, there was a vast desert of nothing. Harry existed in this house as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be raised, and Petunia managed him with the flat, tired efficiency of someone who had agreed to carry a burden and intended to honor that agreement without pretending to like it. Dudley was loved loudly and often. Harry was maintained. The woman with the cats came at 2:30. She appeared at the end of the road, stout, moving slowly, with a large tabby in her arms and a second smaller cat tracking her ankles. She walked the pavement along the Privet Drive side of the street with the careful, slightly sideways gait of someone who was not entirely comfortable on their feet but intended to disguise this. She was perhaps 60, perhaps older, her gray hair pinned untidily and her coat a nondescript brown. Nothing about her warranted a second look, which was, McGonagall noted, a quality in some tension with the deliberateness of her route. She paused at the garden wall of number 4. Not for long, 5 seconds, perhaps, possibly 8, and in that time she looked at the front windows with an attention that had nothing in common with ordinary neighborly curiosity. Her gaze moved from the ground floor window to the upstairs and then, briefly, downward again, as though calculating something. Then, one of the cats at her ankles made a sound of protest and she resumed walking, and she was at the end of the road and gone in under a minute. McGonagall watched her go. She felt the particular unease of a situation whose dimensions she had not correctly mapped. She was not the only one watching number 4. That was evident. The woman was not magical. She had no sense of a witch's specific resonance, and Petunia was a Muggle household, and the Ministry's protection against unregistered magic in Muggle areas was extremely sensitive. But she was not an ordinary passerby either. Someone had placed her here. Someone, or something, had determined that number 4, Privet Drive, warranted observation beyond her own, and she had not been told. She filed this alongside the cupboard and the bottle and the silence, and she stayed where she was. Vernon Dursley arrived home at 5:20. His mood announced itself before his car had fully stopped. The engine cut too suddenly, the door shut with the particular energy of a man for whom the day has been a sustained personal affront. He came up the walk with his jaw set, and he entered the house saying something about traffic that Petunia received from the kitchen without visible sympathy. He hung his coat, loosened his tie, and took up residence in his armchair with the newspaper, and Petunia brought him his tea, and neither of them said anything about the child sleeping in the cupboard under the stairs. Harry woke at 5:10 and cried. Vernon Dursley turned a page of his newspaper. Petunia was in the kitchen again, doing something at the cooker, and the crying carried clearly through the small house. She let it go for several minutes, long enough that McGonagall, in the shrubbery, had begun counting, and then went and attended to him with the same brisk efficiency as before. Vernon did not look up from the newspaper. When Petunia came back through the hallway with Harry against her shoulder, Vernon said, without particular interest, "Is there anything for pudding tonight?" And Petunia said there was a tart, and they had this conversation over Harry's head while he gripped Petunia's shoulder with both hands and looked out at the room with the wide, inarticulate attention of an infant who had not yet learned that some rooms were not meant for him. Petunia returned him to the cupboard before supper. The light was going by then, the sky through the hedge a dark and bluish grey, the street lamps coming on one by one along Privet Drive. It was cold enough now that McGonagall could see her breath when she briefly resumed human form to stretch her back against the side of the house. She transformed again immediately, but in those 2 or 3 seconds she had seen the cupboard from outside, the slant of the stairs visible through the front door glass panel, the crack of darkness below it, no light, no sound, a perfectly ordinary door in a perfectly ordinary house. She left at dusk. She walked to the alley and stood in it for a moment with her hands at her sides, not quite ready to disapparate. The street at the end of the alley looked the same as it had this morning, as it would tomorrow, as it would for years. People brought in their bins. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. Number 4, Privet Drive, sat behind its hedge and contained Harry Potter, who was 15 months old and lived in a cupboard and could be heard crying reliably throughout the day, and was reliably not answered until the sound became too inconvenient to ignore. Dumbledore had weighed it. She thought, standing in the alley in the cold, that she understood now with a precision that had not been available to her last night exactly what he had and had not weighed. He had weighed the blood magic, correctly, irreplaceably. That part she would grant him. He had weighed the strategic necessity of concealment from Voldemort's remaining supporters. He had weighed the safety of the wizarding world against the comfort of one child. What he had not weighed, because he had not stayed to observe, was what a day inside Number 4 actually looked like for Harry Potter. What a day would look like in a year, in 3 and 10. He had weighed a theory of Harry's future and had not remained to watch the first morning of it. She had. She began composing the report as she walked, organizing what she had documented into the formal language the board would require. The observations would be precise, chronological, and unimpeachable. She would not overstate. She would not need to. The facts, arranged in sequence, would do the work themselves. She disapparated without looking back at the street. The fires in her quarters had not been lit. She stood in the doorway, registering this, the familiar smell of the room, cold and book dust and the faint mineral trace of old stone. And then she crossed to the fireplace and lit it herself, because she did not want to summon anyone yet, and because lighting a fire was something she could do without thinking, which was what her hands needed while her mind organized itself. She sat at her desk. She took out parchment, the formal weight she used for official correspondence, and uncapped her ink and held the quill for a moment above the blank page. Then she began. The report took 3 hours. She had known it would. The impulse of the angry was to write fast, to let the outrage carry the argument, and she had spent 40 years learning to resist that impulse in favor of the thing that actually worked: precision. She wrote in the formal register of institutional correspondence, chronological third person. She wrote, "The undersigned has conducted personal observation of the residents at Number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, on the dates of October 31st and November 1st, 1981, in her capacity as Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." She wrote, "The following observations are submitted for the board's formal consideration and are limited to what could be directly witnessed." She did not write, "Albus Dumbledore has put a child in a cupboard and called it protection." She wrote instead about the cupboard's estimated dimensions. She wrote about feeding intervals and their duration. She wrote about the absence of verbal engagement with the infant across all observed interactions, and contrasted this with the substantial verbal engagement observed between Mrs. Petunia Dursley and her biological son over the same period. She noted that the infant had been confined in an unlit space for the majority of his waking and sleeping hours on both dates of observation. She was careful with her language in the way that a surgeon is careful with a scalpel, because she understood that imprecision would give the board the excuse they needed to set the report aside. If she accused, she could be challenged on the basis of overreach. If she documented, they had to address the documentation or explain in writing why they had not. She was forcing them into the position of having a record. That was all she could do from here, and she did it with the full weight of 40 years of institutional knowledge behind every word she chose. The fire burned down, and she rebuilt it without looking up. At some point, a house elf appeared in the corner of the room with a soft pop, carrying a tray, and she said, "Set it down, please," without lifting her eyes from the page. The tray was placed on the side table. She drank the tea when it was cold. At 1:30 in the morning, she set down her quill and read through what she had written. It was good. She did not think this with any satisfaction, because satisfaction was not available to her tonight, but she recognized the quality of it. Precise, damning without being inflammatory, impossible to dismiss on procedural grounds without the board visibly choosing to dismiss it. She had documented what she had seen. The document did the rest. She addressed it to the Board of Governors collectively, all 12 members, not to the headmaster, not through any channel Dumbledore controlled, and at the top of the first page she wrote, "Urgent. Formal request for emergency session," in the deliberate hand she used when she wanted something to look considered rather than panicked, because the board responded better to considered. She signed it with her full title. Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Not Minerva, not M. McGonagall. The full weight of the position, because she was not writing as a private individual with private concerns. She was writing as an institution addressing another institution, and Dumbledore had spent decades making both feel as though they existed in orbit around him. She was reminding them, in the formal language of bureaucratic record, that they did not. She sealed it. Then she sat for a moment looking at the sealed envelope on her desk. She was not under any illusion about what she was doing. She and Albus Dumbledore had worked together for more than 30 years. He would not see this as a legitimate institutional concern. He would see it as a personal challenge, and he would respond to it with the particular combination of warmth and immovability he brought to all personal challenges. Patient, generous, entirely unyielding. Their relationship would be altered by it. She had known all of this before she wrote the first line. The child in the cupboard was more compelling than any of it. She summoned a house elf. The elf arrived in the same corner, blinking at her with the large, uncertain eyes of one who had not expected a second summons that night. "What is your name?" she asked. "Tippy, Professor," the elf said. "Tippy, I need this delivered before dawn, to the Board of Governors, not to the headmaster's office, not through any internal routing, directly to the board's designated post, by whatever mechanism the house elves use for external correspondence." Tippy looked at the envelope with the expression of someone rapidly calculating several things simultaneously. "Tippy can do this, Professor. Tippy knows the board's receiving address." "Good. You are not to mention this errand to anyone, not to another elf, not to any member of staff, not to the headmaster." A pause. "Tippy understands," the elf said carefully, in the tone of a creature who understood perfectly and found the instruction weighty. "Thank you," McGonagall said. She held out the envelope, and Tippy took it in both hands with the particular gravity house elves reserved for tasks they knew to be important. Then the elf was gone, and the room was very quiet. There was nothing left to do, and that was its own difficulty. The work done, the mechanism set in motion, and now nothing between her and the awareness that she was exhausted and that Albus would know before the week was out, perhaps before tomorrow evening. The board's membership included people who liked Dumbledore, and people who liked Dumbledore could be relied upon to inform him that his deputy had filed an urgent formal complaint. Let him know then. Let him read what a day at number 4 actually looked like from the shrubbery. She went to bed at 2 o'clock and lay in the dark listening to the castle settle around her. She had been a student here. She had been a teacher here for longer than some of her colleagues had been alive. She knew the sound of this building in November, the way it breathed in cold weather, the way sound carried differently when most of the students were sleeping. She thought about Harry Potter lying in the dark under the stairs and was not able, for a long time, to sleep. Across the castle, she would learn this later and file it alongside everything else she was filing. Dumbledore sat with his own fire and his certainty intact around him like the walls of a room. He was reviewing the wards, moving through the parameters of the blood protection charm with the focused attention of a man who had constructed something and wished to confirm it still held. It held. The charm was rooted in Petunia's blood, and the roof of her house, and the fact of Harry's residency within it, and everything was as it should be. He made a note in his private ledger, the ward's baseline state, the date, his assessment, and capped his pen and looked out at the dark grounds and thought about Lily Evans, who had been, among many things, remarkable. He did not know about the report. By the time the first grey light was coming through the castle windows and McGonagall had managed 4 hours of restless sleep, Tippy had long since returned, the envelope delivered. Within 2 hours of its arrival, the board's receiving clerk had logged it, noted the urgent designation, and begun notifying members that an emergency session had been formally requested. Word moved through the board's channels the way institutional word always moved, faster than the people sending it understood, and with less fidelity than the people receiving it needed. By the following evening, 11 of 12 board members would know that McGonagall had filed a formal complaint regarding the welfare of Harry Potter. The 12th would know by morning. None of them had yet told Dumbledore. The castle went on around her, doing what castles do, and in little whinging, Harry Potter slept under the stairs, and the wards held, and the day came in without ceremony. He learned on the 3rd of November. The letter came from a board member he had known for 20 years, formal in its address, careful in its language, and therefore unmistakable in its meaning. The board had received a report. The board considered it a matter requiring immediate attention. The board wished to convene. Dumbledore read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk with the deliberate care of a man ensuring that his hands did not reveal the state of his mind, and he sat for a moment looking at Fawkes on his perch. The Phoenix regarded him with one round, incurious eye and made no comment. Dumbledore was grateful for this, as he was frequently grateful for the silences of creatures who could have spoken and chose not to. He knew who had filed the report. There was only one person who had been at Privet Drive, and was not him, and only one person at Hogwarts who would have gone to the board rather than to his office. He did not reach this conclusion with any pleasure. Minerva McGonagall had been his deputy for 11 years. He had relied on her judgment in more situations than he could readily catalogue, and her judgment was, by any reasonable measure, excellent. This was not a question of judgment. This was a question of hierarchy and institutional trust, and of what happened when people with excellent judgment decided to act on it unilaterally rather than through established channels. He knew what happened. He had watched it happen before. The channels existed for a reason. He summoned her by means of a note, delivered by his own owl at 9:30 that morning. 2 words. Her name, and a question mark. She would understand. She arrived at 5 minutes to 10 and did not knock. She never knocked. She had been his deputy long enough that the formality had eroded into this small signal of mutual regard. She came in and sat in the chair across from him and looked at him with the composed expression of someone who had already rehearsed this conversation. "I assume you know," she said. "I know," he said. The fire between them crackled once and settled. He was aware of the weight of what needed saying and the equal weight of what he wished not to say, and he let the silence stand for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You went to the board," he said, keeping his voice precisely level. "Not to me. I went to the board because the matter concerns a child in the care of a headmaster who arranged that care, and an appeal to that headmaster would have been—" She paused, selecting her word with the same care she used on parchment. "Structurally inadequate." "Structurally inadequate," he repeated. "Minerva, if you had concerns, you could have come to my office and told me. That is what the office is for." "I came to your office on the night of the 31st, she said, "and I told you what I had observed, and you told me you had weighed it. You were very certain. I did not think further conversation would produce a different outcome. So instead you produced an institutional record." "Yes." He let the acknowledgement sit between them for a moment. He was not, he reminded himself, angry at her concern. She had watched a child spend his first day in a cupboard, and she had done what her conscience required, and he had 40 years of evidence that her conscience was well calibrated. The anger, and it was there, a controlled burn beneath the calm, was for the method, for the board now holding a document with both their names in it, and for the conversation he would have to have with 12 governors who lacked the full picture and would draw the obvious and incomplete conclusion. "What do you believe the board can do?" he asked, concretely. "What outcome were you hoping for?" "A monitoring protocol," she said. "Formal, documented oversight, someone with authority to visit the house and assess Harry's circumstances on a regular basis, and to compel a response if those circumstances deteriorate. And if they determine that Harry should be removed from the house entirely, then I would want that option available to them. He looked at her steadily. It is not available to them, he said. That is what I need you to understand, not as a matter of my preference, Minerva, as a matter of the magic. She went very still. The blood protection is not a ward I applied to that house, he said. It is not a charm I can extend or transplant. It is rooted in Lily's sacrifice, and in Petunia's blood, and in the fact that Harry lives under her roof, that he calls that house his home. The magic requires it. If Harry were removed to another residence, the charm would not follow him. It would dissolve. He paused. Voldemort's body is destroyed, but his followers are not. The dark magic seeking Harry will not dissolve with it. Without the blood protection, Harry would be vulnerable to every one of them, every moment, without exception. He would not be safer in any other home. He would simply be unprotected. The silence that followed was of a different quality from the ones before it. McGonagall sat with her hands folded in her lap, and something in her face shifted. Not surrender, not agreement, but the particular expression of someone absorbing a structural fact that alters the dimensions of the problem without changing its nature. You did not explain this on the 31st, she said. No, he said. I did not think I needed to. That landed. He saw it land. She did not flinch from it, but she heard it. You still cannot ask me to recant, she said. I am not asking you to recant. I am asking you to consider what the board can actually achieve and what the cost of their achieving it might be. He leaned forward slightly. If they demand Harry's removal, and I am forced to explain in open session why that cannot happen, we have placed information about the blood protection charm into an institutional record. That record has 12 members. 12 members have correspondence. Voldemort is gone, Minerva, but gone is not dead, and the people who served him are watching for exactly this kind of intelligence. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the windows, the sky was a flat November white, the grounds without color. Then, tell them that, she said at last. Tell the board what you told me. Explain the constraint. You would rather not, because explaining means disclosing, and you are accustomed to being trusted without explanation. But if you explain it, even partially, even in closed session, they can make an informed decision. What they cannot do, and what I will not allow to go unchallenged on your behalf, is make no decision at all. He regarded her across the fire. He had known she would not recant. He had known it before he summoned her. He had summoned her anyway because he had needed to say what he had said about the magic, and because he had needed her to hear it from him rather than arrive at its implications alone when the board's proceedings forced the question. The board has called an emergency session, he said. I know. I will attend. I will explain the constraints in sufficient detail to prevent them from demanding removal. He met her eyes. And I will expect you to support the monitoring protocol as the appropriate and proportionate response. She held his gaze for a moment. I will support what is appropriate and proportionate, she said, which was not quite the same thing, and they both knew it. She left without further ceremony. He turned back to Fawkes, who had observed the entire exchange with the patient impartiality of a creature who had watched a great many arguments between people he found equally dear and equally exasperating. 3 days later, the board met in closed session in London. The councillor who had first responded to McGonagall's report presented her findings to the assembled members with the careful neutrality of someone restraining a formed opinion. The debate was not short. There were those who found the documentation unambiguous and the implied neglect plainly unacceptable. There were those who cited Dumbledore's authority and the blood protection magic and the observation that McGonagall had watched from a garden and held no medical standing. The session ran 2 hours past schedule. At one point, the word removal was spoken, and then spoken again, and both times the room shifted uncomfortably and moved on. The charm's mechanics could not be fully disclosed here, not without Dumbledore present. Not without the security risks he had described, and everyone in the room felt the asymmetry of debating a magical constraint none of them had the full details of. In the end, the motion that passed was modest, a formal request for a meeting with the headmaster and a mandate to establish some form of monitoring arrangement for the child's welfare. They did not vote on removal. The final motion was careful not to raise it a third time. Dumbledore received their letter that evening. He read it at his desk, set it beside the first one, and allowed himself a careful measure of relief. The board had arrived exactly where he had expected them to arrive, at the door of his office, requesting that he explain himself, rather than at Privet Drive with the dangerous half-knowledge of people determined to help. He could work with this. He began composing his response, and the fire burned steadily, and Fawkes sang one low note in the corner of the room, and the night outside the tower windows was very quiet. The meeting room the board used for closed sessions was on the 4th floor of a building in Whitehall that appeared, to Muggle eyes, to be the regional office of a surveying firm. McGonagall had been here twice before in her professional life, once for a budget dispute regarding the astronomy tower, once for the formal renewal of Dumbledore's contract 11 years ago. The room had not changed, a long table of dark oak, 12 chairs arranged with bureaucratic symmetry, a single window looking out over a grey November courtyard. No portraits, no fire. The deliberate austerity of an institution that wished to remind everyone present that this was not Hogwarts, and Hogwarts's headmaster did not chair this particular table. Dumbledore arrived precisely on time, which was itself a statement. He wore deep blue robes, and his expression was one McGonagall recognized. Open, attentive, carrying none of the controlled fury she had witnessed in his office 3 days prior. He had put it away. She watched him take his seat, not at the head, because the board's chair sat there, but near enough to the center that his physical presence oriented the room toward him, regardless of the formal arrangement. And she understood, not for the first time, that he was very good at this. She sat across from him. They did not acknowledge each other directly. That, too, was a statement. The sympathetic counselor opened the proceedings with a summary of McGonagall's report. Dry, factual, closely following the document's own language. Feeding intervals, confined space, absence of verbal engagement. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when everyone present has already read the material and formed a position and is waiting to see who speaks first. When the summary concluded, Dumbledore spoke. He laid out the blood protection magic with the patient clarity of a professor who knows the audience is intelligent but not specialist. He did not oversimplify, but he organized his explanation so that each element landed before the next was introduced. Lily's sacrifice, the specific nature of the charm it created, the requirement of Petunia's blood and the roof of her house, the fact of Harry's residency as the mechanism that renewed the protection each year. He spoke of Voldemort's body as destroyed, but his followers as very much present and organized. Azkaban was still processing, and he let that consideration sit in the air for a moment before continuing. The charm, he explained, was not portable. It could not be replicated elsewhere or anchored to a different family. If Harry were removed, even by well-intentioned hands, even to the most loving home in Wizarding Britain, it would dissolve. The child would have no protection beyond whatever conventional wards could be placed, which were not inconsiderable, but were also not impervious, and the level of interest in Harry Potter from the remnants of Voldemort's organization was not comparable to any ordinary threat the board might be weighing. He paused. He had the room. McGonagall watched them, the 12 faces doing the arithmetic, and felt the particular frustration of a person whose argument has just been substantially complicated. She had known this was coming. She had known since his office. It did not make it less difficult to sit across from him while he deployed it with such precision. The counselor who had championed her report said, "Even granting the magical constraint, and I think we must, the welfare concern documented here is not trivial." "It is not," Dumbledore agreed, and the agreement was entirely genuine, which was the thing about him that made him difficult to argue with. He never dismissed the concern. He simply reframed the available responses. "Professor McGonagall's report describes conditions I find deeply imperfect. I would not have chosen this family on the basis of domestic warmth. I chose it on the basis of the charm's requirements, and I wish to be honest with this board about the difference." The counselor pressed him. "And you consider those conditions adequate?" "I consider them survivable," Dumbledore said, "in a situation where the alternative is leaving the child without protection entirely. Harry Potter is 15 months old. Voldemort fell 4 days ago. The people who served him are frightened, scattered, and angry, and some of them are not inclined to accept that it is over. In this moment, in this particular November, the cupboard under the Dursleys' stairs is the safest place in Britain for that child to sleep. That is the calculation I have made." The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone. McGonagall said, The calculation assumes no middle ground between removal and inaction. She kept her voice even. I have not asked this board to remove Harry. I have asked them to establish that someone with standing is watching, that his circumstances are on record and subject to review, so that if those circumstances worsen, the board has the authority to respond, not to relocate him, to require an account. She paused. That is what I am asking for. Dumbledore regarded her. She held the look. He said, any additional magical presence in Little Whinging risks drawing attention to the location. The wards are sensitive, they are not impenetrable, and they function in part on the principle of obscurity. Harry Potter does not appear in any magical registry as residing at that address. If board observers begin visiting the house, we introduce the possibility of magical surveillance catching the pattern and inferring the location. McGonagall said, then the observer need not be magical. The room shifted slightly. Dumbledore was still. She had prepared for this. She said it carefully, without looking at him for longer than was necessary, because she did not want the board to read the exchange as a bilateral negotiation. You have already placed someone in Little Whinging. I observed an individual during my surveillance, not a board representative, not anyone I could identify, but someone watching that house with evident purpose. If a trusted agent is already in place, there is no additional risk in formalizing their function as the board's liaison. The wards are not disturbed, the location is not compromised, and Harry's welfare is subject to institutional oversight rather than private arrangement. The room was very quiet. Dumbledore's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A small, precise recalibration, the face of a man who has just watched an opponent close a door he had been counting on. He confirmed it, finally, carefully, without naming Fig or disclosing her status, saying only that a trusted individual was indeed resident near the house and that her function could be expanded to include welfare reporting to the board, communicated through secure channels, without any additional magical presence in the area. He framed this as his own proposal. He delivered it with the ease of a man offering a solution rather than conceding a point. McGonagall said nothing. The counselor wrote something on the parchment in front of her. The vote was not close. Formal acknowledgement of oversight, structured welfare reporting through the existing trusted agent, no additional magical presence, no removal. The board's mandate would be entered into the closed record. Dumbledore would confirm the reporting arrangement within a fortnight. The session would adjourn. It was not what she had wanted. She had wanted someone with authority standing on that doorstep, visible and accountable, not a proxy arrangement operated through channels Dumbledore already controlled. But it was something. It was Harry's circumstances entered into a record that Dumbledore had not written and could not seal, and the board's formal acknowledgement that those circumstances were a matter of institutional concern, and the precedent that this could be revisited. She collected her papers while the board members dispersed in small conversational clusters. The sympathetic counselor caught her eye across the table, a look that was not an apology and not a victory, and was perhaps the honest expression of a person who had done what the institution allowed and found it insufficient and had no better option available within the meeting's walls. McGonagall gave her a brief acknowledging nod. Outside, she descended to the street. November in London, low sky, the smell of coal smoke and damp stone, ordinary muggles passing with their umbrellas and their total ignorance of the conversation that had just concluded 4 floors above them. A child's fate argued over in a surveyor's meeting room. She stood for a moment on the pavement before disapparating. She had forced the issue into the institutional record. Dumbledore had contained it, adroitly and completely, and had managed to position the containment as cooperation. The seed of doubt she had hoped to plant in the board's collective mind was there. She had seen it in the counselor's face, in the careful silence after Harry's circumstances were described as survivable. But doubt did not protect a 15-month-old sleeping in an unlit cupboard, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. She disapparated. She was back in her classroom by 2:30. The third years had a practical assessment that afternoon, the transformation of hedgehogs into pincushions, a task that reliably sorted the students who had been paying attention from those who had been sitting near students who had been paying attention. And she conducted it with the full attention she would have given it on any other day. She corrected grip and concentration and the tendency of one red-haired girl to think very hard at the animal rather than performing the wand movement that would actually produce a result. She marked 6 satisfactory transformations and 2 excellent ones, and confiscated a chocolate frog from a boy who had apparently decided that the concealment charms they had studied 2 weeks prior were applicable to his own lap. They were not. She told him so and moved on. When the last student filed out at 4 o'clock, she sat down at her desk and allowed herself to be still for a moment. She had secured a record. She had secured a precedent. She had extracted from Dumbledore, in front of 12 witnesses, the admission that he had placed an agent in Little Whinging, which meant the placement was now acknowledged, and the agent's function was now formalized, and Dumbledore could not quietly recall that arrangement without the board noticing its absence. These were not small things. She catalogued them honestly, because she had found over a long career that undervaluing what you had achieved was as distorting as overvaluing it. What she had not secured was visibility. The monitoring would pass through Dumbledore's own network. The reporting would reach the board at his chosen intervals, filtered through his chosen agent, framed in language that he would not write himself, but that the agent would have been briefed to use. The board would receive assurances, and she had no means of verifying what those assurances were built from. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out a plain ledger, not a teaching record, not a staff log, nothing that bore any institutional header or formal purpose. She had bought it in Diagon Alley years ago for a purpose she no longer remembered, and it had sat unused until now. She set it on the desk and opened it to the first page and wrote the date. November 7th, 1981. Beneath it, in her smallest and most precise hand, she wrote a summary of the board meeting's outcome, not her emotional response to it. The outcome, the motion as passed, the terms of the monitoring arrangement as Dumbledore had described them. The fact that the agent had been confirmed as present but not named. The fact that the board had not voted on removal and had not indicated a timeline for revisiting the question. She was not certain what she intended to do with this record. She was certain it should exist. She wrote for 20 minutes. Then she closed the ledger, replaced it in the drawer, and went to prepare the following week's lesson plan. Arabella Figg received a visitor on the evening of the 8th. She had been expecting something of the sort, in the vague way that people who know they are watched expect eventually to hear from the watcher. She had seen the cat on the garden wall, had been quite sure it was not an ordinary cat, and had waited with the resigned patience of someone who had spent 30 years being an afterthought in other people's plans. The knock at her front door was quiet and came at exactly 7:30. She was not surprised to find Dumbledore on her step, surprised perhaps that he had come himself rather than sent an owl. But she supposed that some conversations were not suited to parchment. She showed him into her sitting room, which smelled of cats and old upholstery, and offered him tea, which he accepted, and they sat across from each other while Mr. Tibbles made his opinion of the intrusion known from the doorway. Dumbledore told her about the board meeting. He did it in the oblique fashion of someone conveying what you needed to know while reserving the architecture of the situation for himself. She understood that the board now knew of her existence in the general sense that they had formalized a monitoring role and that she would be asked to produce periodic reports on Harry's welfare to be delivered through Dumbledore and then on to the board. "Through you," she said. "I will transmit them accurately," he said. "I know you will." She set her cup down. "But through you." He regarded her with the expression she imagined he used when students were being slow on a concept that he had already explained. "Arabella, the board's formal record exists. Your function is acknowledged. If anything were to happen to Harry, if circumstances were to change materially, the monitoring arrangement gives us a documented basis for response. That is a meaningful improvement. And my reports to you, those I've always made, do I continue those separately? Yes. So I report to you, and I report to the board through you, and the board believes they have independent oversight." "The board has oversight," Dumbledore said. "That I am the conduit does not make it illusory." She was quiet for a moment. Mr. Tibbles had advanced from the doorway to the arm of the nearest chair, and was watching Dumbledore with open suspicion, which she found broadly reasonable. "I don't like it," she said. "I know. I'll do it," she said. "Because I don't see what else there is to do, and because I trust that you want him safe. But I don't like it, and I want that said plainly." "It is said plainly," Dumbledore agreed, with a warmth that was entirely genuine and changed nothing structural, and she showed him out at 8:45 and stood for a moment in her hallway after the door closed, listening to the ordinary sounds of Privet Drive settling into its evening routine. She did want him safe. She had wanted it since before he arrived. She went back to her sitting room and found that Mr. Tibbles had taken her chair. The letter came to Petunia on a Wednesday morning. She almost didn't open it. It was sealed with an unfamiliar wax crest, not Hogwarts, not anything she recognized from the previous 12 years of trying not to recognize things, and it was addressed to her in full, correctly spelled on parchment that had no business existing in a postbox on Privet Drive. She stood in the hallway holding it, while Dudley banged his spoon against his high chair tray in the kitchen, and the smell of burnt toast drifted through the gap in the door. Then she opened it, because she had never been able to leave a letter unopened, regardless of what she feared it contained. It informed her, in language of considerable formality and considerable vagueness, that the Hogwarts Board of Governors had an interest in the welfare of Harry James Potter, currently residing at her address, and that periodic welfare monitoring would occur in accordance with the board's responsibilities under magical child protection protocols. It thanked her for her cooperation, which she had not offered. It was signed by the board collectively. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and placed it face down on the hallway table and went into the kitchen and removed Dudley's spoon before the tray cracked. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something that sat adjacent to fear and was in some respects worse. She was furious, and she was furious in the particular way of a person who had known this would happen and had warned herself against hoping otherwise, and who had hoped nonetheless. She had taken the boy in. She had fed him and clothed him, and she had not done it cheerfully, but she had done it. And now there were 12 robed strangers who had decided this was their concern, and they would descend on her household with their monitoring and their parchments and their magical crest, and they would judge her household by criteria she had no access to and render conclusions she had no standing to contest. She looked across the kitchen to the cupboard door. It was a practical arrangement, she had told herself when she made it. The small bedroom was full of Dudley's things, and she had not had time to clear it, and the cupboard was clean and adequately ventilated, and she had put a proper blanket in it. She had told herself that, and she had mostly believed it, in the way that people believe things that are convenient to believe. She crossed to the cupboard, opened it, and looked at the arrangement inside with the eyes of someone imagining it documented on parchment in a formal record. The blanket, the shelf above, with the mop she had moved to the other cupboard, the strip of light from the hallway, which was the only light. She closed the cupboard door. She thought about the letter. She thought about 12 strangers with a formal interest in her household and no ability to understand what she had agreed to take on, and no gratitude for the taking of it. Then she went and lifted Harry out of the cupboard and took him into the kitchen and put him in the second chair at the table, the one that had been serving as a surface for the post, and she shifted the post to the counter. He regarded her with his mother's eyes, which she did not look at directly. She gave him a piece of dry toast, and he held it with both hands and bit at it with the imprecise enthusiasm of a child who had not fully mastered the process. She did not speak to him. She was not going to speak to him, but she let him sit at the table. In her office at Hogwarts, McGonagall spent that Wednesday evening reviewing the documentation she had begun. She added 2 lines, a note that the monitoring arrangement was now presumably in effect, and a note that she did not know who the agent was, had no means of contacting them, and had no way of verifying that any report produced had been transmitted without alteration. Then she sat back and looked at what she had written, and she thought about Dumbledore reading the same ward monitoring ledger he had described to her in his own office, with Fawkes for company, certain that he had accounted for all the variables. She opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote a single line in the margin, in handwriting smaller than her usual notation, as though she were reminding herself rather than recording a fact. The boy is protected by magic older than Dumbledore's will, but he is not beyond the reach of duty. She capped her ink, closed the ledger, and replaced it in the drawer. She would keep watching. It was, at present, the only thing within her power that the situation had not yet absorbed. The summons arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under her office door sometime before she woke, written on board stationery in a hand she recognized from the meeting's sign-in sheet. The sympathetic counselor. She had expected to hear from her eventually, in some form. The wordless acknowledgement across the table had carried the shape of an unfinished sentence. She had not expected it quite this soon, or quite this directly. The note requested a private meeting at her earliest convenience, outside Hogwarts, and named a street in Diagon Alley she did not immediately place. It was unsigned beyond the board's collective crest, which was its own kind of signal. If you were signing with a crest rather than a name, you were not signing as yourself. She sent a reply by return owl and cleared a Friday afternoon. The tea room was narrow and set back from the main alley behind a confectioner's that had been there since McGonagall was a student. She had walked past it for 40 years without once going in. Inside, low ceilings, dark wood, 4 tables of which only 2 were occupied, a fire that did not require any assistance from the weather outside to justify its presence. Wizarding London had establishments like this in the way that old cities had courtyards. They existed in the gaps between things that were meant to be found, and you came to know them only when someone else thought you should. The counselor was already seated. She was perhaps 60, with the particular self-possession of a woman who had spent a career operating in rooms that had not been designed with her presence in mind. She wore no board insignia. She had ordered tea and not touched it. McGonagall sat. A second cup appeared. "I appreciate the discretion," the counselor said. "I assumed it was required," McGonagall said. "Or you'd have written to me through official channels." "Yes." She turned her cup once in its saucer. "The board is not unified. I expect you sensed that in the meeting." "I sensed that the meeting's outcome suited Dumbledore considerably better than it suited anyone else at the table." "It did," the counselor said without apparent defensiveness. Some members were relieved by that. They want the formal record to exist, but they have no appetite for what enforcing it would require. Dumbledore is... The difficulty with Dumbledore is that opposing him openly means being prepared to lose to him openly, and most of my colleagues are not prepared for that. McGonagall said. "And you?" "I am prepared to lose to him slowly," the counselor said, "which is a different thing." The fire shifted. Outside, through the small window, someone passed carrying a very large brown paper parcel and negotiating the width of the alley with the focused expression of a person who had done this before and not enjoyed it. The counselor explained the board's position with the precision of someone who had mapped it carefully before arriving. There were 12 members. 4 would support further intervention if the evidence warranted it. 3 would not act under any circumstances while Dumbledore held the headmaster's office. The remaining 5 would follow whichever argument appeared more defensible at the time, which meant they would follow evidence, if evidence existed, and follow Dumbledore in its absence. "We need independent documentation," she said. "Not through Dumbledore's agent. Not filtered." "You're asking me to continue observing Privet Drive?" "Periodically, covertly, twice per term, perhaps, whatever is compatible with your duties at Hogwarts, enough to give us a picture that doesn't originate with Dumbledore." McGonagall said, "And these observations would go to you directly." "To me. I would share the relevant details with the 4 sympathetic members. Nothing enters the formal record until we have enough to compel the full board's attention, until the picture is coherent enough that the middle 5 cannot dismiss it." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She understood the logic. She also understood that what she was being asked to do was conduct unsanctioned surveillance on a private household outside her professional remit in deliberate circumvention of Dumbledore's arrangements. She had already done it once, in November, but she had done it before the board's monitoring protocol existed. The protocol's existence changed the ethical character of further independent observation, because now she would be operating in parallel to a formal arrangement she had herself argued for. She thought about the ledger in her desk drawer, the note she had written in the margin. "I'll do it," she said. "Twice per term in cat form, on the pretext of other business in Little Whinging. I won't manufacture evidence, and I won't overstate what I observe. If the conditions have improved, I'll say so. I wouldn't want otherwise. And I cannot make this my primary concern," McGonagall said. "My duties at Hogwarts are not optional. If term demands conflict with an observation window, the observation waits." "Understood. What I find, I'll write to you directly, sealed, by personal owl. Not through the board's post, and I'll keep my own records separately." The counselor nodded. She lifted her tea, finally, and drank it with the air of someone completing a transaction they had been turning over for some time. They did not discuss what they were doing in any broader moral terms. There was no need. They both knew what it was. And they had both arrived at the same conclusion about whether it was justified, and the framing of it as institutional self-defense against Dumbledore's unilateral authority was not a rationalization so much as an accurate description. McGonagall paid for the tea, which was not discussed, but seemed correct. She was back at Hogwarts before dinner. The coldness she had noticed in Dumbledore since the board meeting had not resolved. She had hoped, in a small practical way, that it might, That time would soften the professional distance and restore something closer to the working relationship they had maintained for 20 years. It had not. He was civil. He was entirely, completely civil, which was precisely the problem. The warmth had not vanished, but had been placed behind something, a politeness that functioned as perimeter, letting nothing out and nothing in. He greeted her in the corridor on Friday evening and asked about the third year's practical assessment with every appearance of interest. She told him it had gone adequately. He said he was glad to hear it. They continued in opposite directions. She had known this might happen. She had been prepared to accept it when she filed the report in November, and she had accepted it again at every subsequent decision. The acceptance was genuine. But genuine acceptance was not the same as not feeling the loss, and she had been honest enough with herself for long enough to know the difference. Her office felt quieter than it had in September. She had attributed it to the year's end approaching, to the particular quality of December dark outside the windows, to the simple fact of fatigue. She did not entirely believe her own attributions. She kept her Tuesday evening free for student queries, as she always had. Fewer students came in December. She sat at her desk and marked second-year essays on switching spells, and let herself notice, without indulging it, the absence of the occasional knock from Dumbledore's side of the corridor, the idle academic question, the offered biscuit, the conversation that had started about one thing and become about another over the course of a quarter hour. Those had been, she recognized now, the mechanism by which they had remained something closer to colleagues than to headmaster and deputy. Without them, she was the deputy headmistress, and he was the headmaster. And that was a more formal arrangement than she had understood herself to be living inside. She marked the essays. She recorded the grades. She put the stack in the appropriate tray. She did not knock on his door. She did not know, because she could not, that Dumbledore spent part of that same evening reviewing the ward monitoring ledger he had begun in November and adding a new layer of misdirection charms to the surrounding streets, not to the house itself, which the blood protection made unnecessary, but to the approach paths, the sight lines, the small garden of the woman 3 doors down who had particular habits of observation from her front step. He was thorough. He had always been thorough. The new charms were not aggressive, not alarming. They were the magical equivalent of persuading someone that they had already looked in that direction and found nothing of interest. He was protecting Harry. That was true without qualification, and she would have granted it freely if asked. He was also making it harder to see what she had already arranged to see. That was also true, and she kept it in the ledger when she wrote her entry that night, dated in her smallest and most precise hand, a record of what had been agreed in the tea room, what she had committed to, what she would need to account for if it ever came to light. She noted the protocol. She noted the counselor, identified by role and not by name, which felt like a precaution worth taking. She noted that the situation was now more complex and no less urgent than it had been in November. Then she capped her ink and went to bed and slept, because she had found, over a long career, that regret and duty both kept better hours when she was rested. She went in mid-December, on a Wednesday, when the term had wound down far enough that her absence for an afternoon would not require explanation. She told the staff rota that she had personal business in Surrey. Nobody asked what sort. The journey took 40 minutes by apparition and a short walk from the nearest concealed point, which was a postal sorting office on the far edge of Little Whinging, with enough ambient noise to cover a displacement. She had worn plain muggle clothes, a dark green coat that had served her adequately for 20 years, sensible shoes, nothing that would read as unusual on a residential street in December. She transformed on the pavement 3 houses down, in the gap between a privet hedge and a parked car, and moved the rest of the distance as a cat. It was cold. The sky had the sealed, whitish quality of weather that intended snow, and had not yet committed. The street was quiet at 2:30 on a Wednesday. A delivery van at the far end, a child's bicycle abandoned on a lawn 2 doors up, the ordinary suburban stillness of a place where most people were at work and most children were at school. She settled herself on the low wall that divided the front garden of number 4 from the pavement and observed. The house was decorated for Christmas in the manner of a household where decoration was a social obligation rather than a pleasure. A wreath on the door that was clearly new and clearly chosen to match the neighbors, a string of lights along the front eave that had been switched off in daylight. Through the front window, past the net curtain, she could make out the living room arrangement. A playpen had been positioned near the sofa, in the rough center of the room, where it would be visible from the kitchen doorway. Harry was in it. He was standing, which she registered, filed, noted as developmental progress she had no baseline to appreciate. She had never observed an infant closely enough to know precisely what 16 months looked like in practice, but the standing was apparent and the gripping of the playpen's top rail was practiced rather than tentative. He was wearing a yellow knitted garment that was too large for him by some margin and had been turned up at the wrists. He was not crying. He was not being spoken to. He was watching the kitchen doorway with the focused attention of a child who had identified that doorway as the origin of intermittent events. Petunia moved through the kitchen twice in the time McGonagall watched. The first time she carried laundry. The second time she stopped in the doorway, looked at Harry and said something. One syllable, possibly his name, possibly an instruction, before continuing. He did not turn toward her. She did not wait to see if he would. It was not warmth. McGonagall was not going to record it as warmth. But it was acknowledgement, which was more than November had contained, and she noted it alongside the playpen's position and the turned-up wrists and the practical fact of visibility. The child could be seen from where his guardian worked, and that was a structural improvement over a cupboard that had to be opened before anyone knew what was inside it. She watched for another 20 minutes. Petunia fed Harry at 3 o'clock, strained vegetables from a jar, administered with the clinical efficiency of a woman doing a task she had learned to perform correctly and had no interest in decorating. Harry ate it with the equanimity of someone who had not known food to arrive any other way. There was no conversation. There was no song. There was the jar and the spoon and the kitchen table and Petunia's expression, which was not unkind and was not kind and was simply elsewhere. McGonagall was still on the wall when she heard the footsteps. A woman came along the pavement from the direction of the cul-de-sac, stout, gray-haired, moving at the deliberate pace of someone whose walk was part of a routine rather than a destination. A cat accompanied her, a large tom with a proprietary manner, staying precisely one pace behind her left ankle. The woman was wearing a green woolen hat and carrying a net shopping bag with very little in it. McGonagall recognized her. Not as an individual, she still had no name, no identification, no means of placing her more precisely than she had in November. But she recognized the quality of the attention. The woman's gaze, as she passed the gate of number 4, moved the way a watcher's gaze moved, cataloging rather than observing, registering the playpen through the window with a specific kind of noticing that was different from a neighbor's idle glance. She paused for half a second, adjusted her grip on the net bag, and continued. The tom looked at McGonagall. She did not move. Cats were territorial about strangers in their domain, and a standoff with someone else's familiar, if that was what he was not something she had budget for this afternoon. The tom considered her for a moment with the specific disdain of a cat who had concluded that the situation was beneath comment and then continued after his owner. McGonagall watched them go, so Dumbledore's agent had a cat, or kept cats, or the cat kept her, which was often the more accurate description. The woman passed the end of the street and turned without looking back, and the afternoon resettled into its ordinary state, and McGonagall sat on the wall for another few minutes before she slipped down and walked back the way she had come. She composed the letter to the counselor that evening in her office, in the small cipher they had agreed on in the tea room. Not elaborate, nothing that would resist determined professional scrutiny, but enough to make casual interception uninformative. She wrote that circumstances were marginally improved, that confinement persisted at night, that external pressure had had modest effect. She sealed it with plain wax and no mark, and sent it by a school owl borrowed under the pretext of general correspondence, addressed to the counselor's personal residence rather than her board office, and she watched the owl angle south out the tower window and became aware, in the specific way of someone standing alone in a cold stairwell after a decision, that she had now committed herself to a rhythm. Twice per term. The first had been done, the second would come in February, and the third after Easter, and so on, in the kind of accumulation that produced records rather than incidents. Christmas arrived at Hogwarts in the usual fashion. Decorations that appeared overnight without anyone's direct involvement. A population that halved as students departed for family. A quietness in the corridors that was either peaceful or bleak, depending on what you had to return to. McGonagall did not return to Surrey for Christmas. She remained at Hogwarts, as she did most years, to oversee the skeleton staff arrangements and attend the small faculty dinner that Dumbledore hosted on Christmas Day in the staff room rather than the Great Hall, a distinction that she now understood carried a particular social weight when the relationship between two of the attendees had been reduced to formal civility. She sat 2 seats away from him and discussed the second year's upcoming theory assessment with Pomona Sprout, who was warm and sensible and did not notice that McGonagall's attention occasionally strayed to the other end of the table, where Dumbledore was explaining something to Professor Flitwick with the animated pleasure of a man who had genuinely enjoyed his day. He looked well. He looked exactly as he always did. She did not know why she had expected otherwise. Pomona asked her if she had managed to get away at all over the break, and McGonagall said she had had a brief errand in Surrey earlier in the month, and Pomona said that Surrey was a funny place to have an errand, and moved on to the question of whether herbology should be assessed practically in the spring term, or whether the greenhouses were too cold for a fair environment. And McGonagall was grateful for the conversation and gave it the attention it deserved. Somewhere south of Hogwarts, in a house on a residential street that was by now thoroughly decorated in the social obligation manner, Harry Potter reached 16 months old on the 31st of July. But that day was in summer, and this was Christmas, and there was no milestone at Christmas to acknowledge, no particular threshold crossed, no morning in the Dursley household that was in any way different from the morning before it. Petunia moved through her kitchen in the way she had learned to move through it with an additional person's requirements to accommodate. Vernon ate his breakfast and read his paper and left for work. Dudley was given a new toy because it was Christmas, and the new toy was superior to all previous toys and absorbed his full attention. Harry was placed in the playpen with a board book that had previously been Dudley's, the pages chewed at the corners and one missing entirely. He turned the pages with his mother's hands. McGonagall did not know that. She was 40 miles north at a staff room table discussing herbology. She knew what she had seen in December. She knew it was not enough, and that it was more than nothing, and that the distance between those two assessments was where she would be living for the foreseeable future. She had begun to understand, in the way of a person who has been honest with themselves for long enough, that this was not a situation with a resolution point, not a case she was building toward a verdict, not a process with a defined end. It was a vigil, long, incremental, without ceremony, the kind of work that produced no gratitude and required none. She refilled Pomona's tea and her own, and the fire was warm, and outside the windows the grounds were white. The second board meeting was called for the 14th of January, which was a Thursday, and which gave the term enough runway behind it that Dumbledore could reasonably present himself as a man who had spent the intervening weeks attending to the matter with appropriate diligence. McGonagall noted the timing. It was precise in the way that Dumbledore's choices tended to be precise, not obviously strategic, but never accidentally convenient. The meeting room was the same one as November, the same long table, the same portraits doing their best to appear uninvested in proceedings, the same arrangement of water glasses that nobody touched. The weather outside was January rather than November, which meant it was worse and less interesting about being so. McGonagall arrived early, as she always did, and found 3 other members already seated, and the counselor at the far end of the table, with a folder of papers and a stillness about her that communicated she had also arrived early and spent the intervening time in thought. They did not greet each other beyond a nod. The unsealed nature of their private arrangement required that their professional relationship appear unchanged, which meant formal courtesy and no particular warmth. McGonagall took her chair and poured herself water and did not drink it. Dumbledore arrived last, which was also timing, though she could not have specified exactly what it timed. He presented his information about Harry's welfare with the smoothness of a man who had organized his material so carefully that the organization itself was invisible. The Dursleys were providing adequate shelter. Harry was receiving regular feeding. He had been assessed as physically healthy by his general practitioner, whose records Dumbledore cited with the confidence of someone who had seen them. He had been relocated, as the board was no doubt gratified to learn, from his initial sleeping arrangement to a more suitable situation. The word suitable did its work and moved on without defining itself. "The blood protection magic," Dumbledore said, "remains fully intact. My own monitoring of the ward structure confirms it. The child is as safe as magic can make him." He did not mention the cupboard. He did not mention the playpen visible only from the kitchen doorway. He did not mention the absence of conversation, of name use, of any of the small daily evidence that a person recognized another person as worth addressing. The feeding intervals were adequate. The shelter was present. The physical health record existed. These things were true. McGonagall sat with her hands flat on the table and listened. "We are confident," Dumbledore continued, That the monitoring arrangement formalized at the November meeting is functioning as intended. Mrs. Fig. And here he paused, fractionally, which was the only indication that he was aware of what he was doing. Provides regular, reliable reports. The board can be assured that any material change in Harry's circumstances will be identified promptly. It was the first time he had named her. McGonagall kept her expression arranged. Fig. The grey-haired woman with the net bag and the tomcat and the deliberate pause at the gate was called Fig. She filed it and did not let it reach her face. The board received the presentation with the responses it had been crafted to produce. The three members who would never act against Dumbledore settled back with the relieved posture of people who had been given permission to stop worrying. Two of the middle five asked questions about the blood protection mechanics and appeared satisfied with the answers. The meeting had the quality of a document being signed. The substance had been decided elsewhere, and this was the formalization. When the questions had run their course, McGonagall said, "I'd like to put something to the board formally." There was a pause. Not hostile, simply the pause of people recalibrating. "Of course," the chair said. "I'd like the board to confirm in writing," McGonagall said, "that it has accepted responsibility for the ongoing oversight of Harry Potter's welfare. Not that it has received assurances, that it has accepted responsibility. The distinction seems to me a material one." Silence. It was a different quality of silence from the pause. "The board already voted on a monitoring protocol in November," one of the members said. "Yes," McGonagall said. "I'm asking for written confirmation that the board understands itself to be accountable for that protocol's outcomes. If the protocol functions as intended, this confirmation costs nothing. If it does not function as intended, the confirmation means the board cannot subsequently claim that responsibility belonged to someone else." The member looked at Dumbledore. Most of them did. Dumbledore said pleasantly, "I have no objection to the board documenting its responsibilities. That seems entirely consistent with good governance." He said it as though it were a small thing. McGonagall was fairly certain he knew exactly what it was. The chair called a brief procedural vote. The motion carried unanimously, which was the only option once Dumbledore had declined to oppose it. Voting against written documentation of one's own stated responsibilities was a particular kind of self-exposure that nobody at that table was willing to undertake. The clerk made a note. The formal written confirmation would be drafted and circulated within a fortnight. After the meeting, as the members filed out into the corridor and the usual clusters formed around the water table, the counselor appeared at McGonagall's shoulder. "A word," she said quietly. They found an empty antechamber, small, with someone's winter coat forgotten on the back of a chair, and a window overlooking an interior courtyard that received no direct light in January. The counselor closed the door. "The board agreed to something else," she said. "In November, after you left, an administrative subcommittee discussion. I should have told you sooner. We've established a permanent child welfare monitoring protocol." McGonagall waited. "Not specific to Harry. It extends to any student placed in a non-magical household for any reason, for any duration. Annual reporting requirements. Independent review of living conditions on a 3-yearly cycle. The headmaster's designated agent in any such arrangement must report directly to the board's welfare subcommittee as well as to the headmaster." McGonagall was quiet for a moment, understanding the architecture of it. "So Fig reports to the board." "She will be required to, yes. The notification goes out next month." "Does Dumbledore know?" "He will when the notification goes out." The counselor's expression was neutral. "He wasn't consulted on the protocol's scope. Administratively, the board has the authority to establish its own reporting requirements without the headmaster's input. It's an internal governance matter." McGonagall looked at the forgotten coat on the chair. It was a good coat, dark wool, and someone was going to be cold without it. She wondered how long it had been there. "He'll challenge the scope." "He may. But challenging the board's right to receive reports from people already operating in his arrangements is an uncomfortable position to occupy publicly." "Yes," McGonagall said. "It is." She understood what the counselor had built. Not a confrontation. Dumbledore would have won a confrontation in January 1982 without difficulty. His authority was too established, his standing too absolute. What she had built instead was a structure. A set of requirements that existed independently of any individual dispute, that predated any specific case, that could not be unwound without a formal vote that would itself generate a record. The protocol did not remove Dumbledore's control over Harry's placement. It meant he could not exercise that control in complete institutional darkness. "The protocol won't move, Harry," McGonagall said. "No," the counselor agreed. "It won't. And if Fig's reports to the board are filtered through Dumbledore's guidance, if she understands herself to be his agent first and the board's informant second, then the protocol's independence is theoretical. It's more than theoretical. She'll be signing her name to formal documents. If she omits material information, the responsibility is hers as well as his." That, McGonagall acknowledged to herself, was not nothing. It was considerably less than what Harry needed at 4 months, at 16 months, and it was considerably more than the board had offered in November. She had stopped expecting the situation to resolve cleanly. Clean resolutions belonged to cases with single points of failure, and this was not that. Dumbledore's authority was not a single point. It was a distributed weight, embedded in 40 years of trust and 40 years of being right, and it would not shift because one deputy headmistress and one sympathetic counselor had found a mechanism for institutional accountability. But mechanisms accumulated. She had learned that, over the last 2.5 months, in the particular way that one learned things that were not encouraging, but were nonetheless true. A formal report, an emergency board session, a monitoring protocol, a written confirmation of responsibility, a permanent welfare framework. Each of these was small. Together, they described a world that was, in a structural sense, slightly different from the world that had existed on the evening of October 31st, when Dumbledore had placed a sleeping infant on a doorstep and departed before the household woke. She was not going to call that a victory. Victory implied a conclusion, and there was no conclusion available. Only the ongoing fact of Harry, in a playpen with a board book with chewed corners, watched at intervals by a woman with cats who now reported to 2 different authorities and understood herself fully aligned with only one. "Thank you," McGonagall said, "for the notification and for November." The counselor said, "He is going to be a remarkable young man, if we do our jobs properly." It was the first time either of them had said anything that direct, and it sat in the room for a moment before the counselor opened the door, and they returned to the corridor and the ordinary distances of professional acquaintance. McGonagall, apparated back to Hogsmeade in the early afternoon, walked the path to the castle in the January cold, and went directly to her office. She opened the private ledger and wrote the date and a summary of the meeting's formal outcome, and the protocol's existence, and the confirmation vote. She noted Fig's name, now known, and the character of the observation she had conducted on Fig's behalf without Fig's knowledge. She noted that the meeting had produced a structural change rather than a personal resolution, and that the distinction was one she had made her peace with. She did not write that she had hoped for more. That was not the kind of thing the ledger was for. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early February, which was 2 weeks after the board's formal notification had gone out to Arabella Fig at her address in Little Whinging, which McGonagall knew because the counselor had told her it would take a fortnight to process through the administrative clerk's office. She had been waiting for some reaction. She had not been certain what form it would take. The envelope was plain, muggle paper rather than parchment, addressed in the small, neat hand of someone who had learned to write with a muggle pen and had never fully trusted quills. No return address. Inside, a single folded sheet, also muggle paper, with 8 lines of text. The handwriting was the same throughout, which suggested it had been composed at a single sitting and not revised. The 8 lines asked, in oblique terms that could be read by anyone, as an inquiry about a shared acquaintance's health, whether Professor McGonagall might be available to take a brief walk in the vicinity of Clover Green Park, Little Whinging, on the following Saturday evening, after 6 o'clock. McGonagall read it twice, then set it on the desk and looked at it from a small distance, as one sometimes looked at an object one was not sure whether to handle further. What the letter meant was this. Fig had identified that her situation had changed, had decided she required a direct conversation outside Dumbledore's awareness, and had chosen to contact McGonagall specifically, which meant she had known somehow that McGonagall was worth contacting. That last part required consideration. It meant either that Fig had been told something she wasn't meant to have, or that she had observed enough from her position on the pavement to draw her own conclusions. Either way, the letter existed, and it had been sent to Hogwarts, and someone had decided it was worth the risk. McGonagall went on the Saturday. Clover Green was not a park in any ambitious sense, a flattened acre of grass maintained by the council, a row of benches along its eastern edge, a path that looped around a small, ornamental garden that was ornamental in April and structural concrete the rest of the year. In February, at 6:15 in the evening, it was empty and very cold, the kind of cold that made the street lamps along the perimeter look warmer than they were. McGonagall came in Muggle clothes again, on foot from the concealment point, and did not transform. Whatever this conversation was, it needed to happen between two women who could look at each other. Fig was already there. She was on the second bench from the path's entrance, a thermos flask on the seat beside her, a brown coat buttoned to the collar, her breath visible in the lamplight. Two cats attended her, the large Tom from December, and a smaller tortoiseshell that observed McGonagall's approach with the discernment of an animal that had formed a preliminary opinion and was revising it in real time. They assessed each other for a moment in the manner of two people who had been aware of each other's existence for some time without formal introduction. "Professor," Fig said. "Mrs. Fig," McGonagall said, and sat down on the far side of the thermos. The park remained empty. A car passed on the road behind the hedge, its headlights sweeping briefly across the grass, and then it was dark again except for the orange perimeter lamps. Fig said, "I received a letter from the board's welfare subcommittee. They've asked me to submit my observations on Harry's welfare directly to them as well as through my existing arrangement." She did not say Dumbledore's name. McGonagall noted it without comment. "I understand." "He doesn't know yet," Fig said, "about the board's requirement. I expect he will shortly, but he hasn't raised it with me." A pause. The Tom shifted his weight. "When he does, I'll be expected to tell him that I've been informed. He'll want to know what I intend to do." "And what do you intend to do?" Fig turned the thermos once in her hands, a slow half-rotation. "I've been on this street for 18 months. I moved here because Albus asked me to, because I trusted his judgment, because I think, that Harry Potter needs someone watching." She stopped. "I agreed to report to the board through him, which I understood to mean that my reports would arrive at the board in a form he'd reviewed. I accepted that." Another pause. Longer. "I didn't know it meant the board would be receiving a version of events rather than the events." McGonagall said nothing. The night was cold enough that she was aware of her own stillness as an effort. "The board's letter asked specific questions," Fig said. "Developmental indicators, behavioral observations, evidence of verbal engagement. It was a proper questionnaire." She looked at the tortoiseshell, who was regarding the ornamental garden with professional skepticism. "I've been writing my reports in general terms because general terms were what I understood to be required. If I'd known the board wanted specifics, I'd have provided specifics." She said this without heat, factually, as a woman identifying the gap between what she'd been told and what was true. "The questions the subcommittee asked me were not the questions I'd been asked to answer." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of the architecture, offered to someone Fig had apparently decided was capable of comprehending architecture. "No," McGonagall agreed quietly. "They weren't." They sat for a moment with the weight of that between them. "I'll answer the board's questionnaire honestly," Fig said. "I wanted you to know that, and I'd like, if you're willing, to have some means of communicating with you separately. Not through the board's formal channels, not through Albus. Directly." McGonagall looked at the park, the empty benches, the concrete garden, the cats, the cold. She thought about the private ledger in her office, and the sealed letters to the counselor, and the twice-yearly visits in a form that could not speak but could see everything. "What I can offer you," she said, "is protection. If your honesty with the board creates difficulty in your existing arrangement, I'll put it before the institutional record that you acted in good faith, that your reporting was accurate, and that any limitation on that accuracy was structural rather than deliberate. You will not be the one held responsible." Fig was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing." "No, it isn't." "And in exchange," Fig said, "you want to know what I see." "Yes." The Tom stood, stretched elaborately, and resettled with his back to both of them, facing the hedge, which apparently concluded the matter to his satisfaction. Fig looked at him, and something in her expression eased by a small degree. "Wednesday mornings," she said. "He's in the front garden, weather permitting. Petunia puts him out while she does the weekly clean, 10 minutes, sometimes 15. In December, he was beginning to pull himself upright against the fence, He's walking now, a little, holding on. He doesn't cry much. She said the last observation without any interpretive gloss. It hung in the air between them, and they both understood what it described. An infant who had learned not to expect a response. McGonagall said carefully, "You care about him." Fig said, "Yes." Simply, without embarrassment. Whatever his future requires, it starts with someone knowing his name. They established the practical arrangements in a quarter of an hour. Muggle envelopes, no return address, the same oblique register Fig had used for this one. A monthly summary of Harry's observable development, anything notable in Petunia's treatment, any sign of direct harm. McGonagall would read them and update the ledger. Nothing would rout through Dumbledore. When they stood to leave, Fig said, "He trusts me, you know. Albus. He trusts me because I've given him no reason not to." McGonagall said, "Then continue to give him no reason not to." She met Fig's eyes briefly. That trust is more useful to Harry than any alternative. She walked back to the concealment point alone, her shoes on the cold pavement, and thought about what they had built in the time it took a thermos to cool. Not a conspiracy. Neither of them was constituted for conspiracy. Fig was too candid, and McGonagall was too institutional, and both of them believed, in the fundamental way of people who had spent their adult lives inside systems, that documentation outlasted defiance. What they had built was a channel. Unglamorous, unwitnessed, requiring no extraordinary loyalty, simply the ongoing willingness of two women to tell each other the truth about a child they had both been assigned to watch from a distance. Dumbledore would know eventually that something had changed in the quality of the information reaching the board. He was too precise a reader of institutional weather not to notice. What he would not know, not yet, possibly not for some time, was where the change had originated or how far the coordination extended. He would feel the resistance before he could map it. That was, McGonagall thought, both the strength and the limitation of what they had done. It would frustrate him without giving him a target. She transformed at the postal sorting office and was back at Hogwarts before 9. The ledger entry that night was the briefest she had written. The date, Fig's name, the word channel, the phrase direct, accurate, independent, and then a line she had not planned to write and wrote anyway. She said he doesn't cry much. Below that, she closed the book. The misdirection charms Dumbledore had laid around Privet Drive's approach paths were more sophisticated in February than they had been in December. McGonagall felt them differently, a subtle wrongness in the air, a faint inclination to turn left at the corner rather than right, to find the back lane more interesting than the front street. She had expected something of the sort and moved through the sensation as one moved through a cold draft, registering it without yielding to it. He had not charmed the house itself. He could not, without interfering with the blood wards. She filed the increased complexity of the perimeter and found her position on the garden wall before 7 in the morning, while the street was still grey and the curtains on either side of number 4 were uniformly closed. Late February 1982 was damp and colourless, the kind of English winter that had given up any intention of being dramatic and settled into a long administrative greyness. The garden at number 4 was maintained to the same standard as its neighbours. Nothing overgrown, nothing neglected, the lawn uniformly brown. McGonagall arranged herself along the wall's top edge and waited. The household woke in the usual sequence. Vernon's car reversed out of the drive at 8:10, a light in the kitchen, the kettle audible through the glass. Then Petunia, moving in the window's frame, and then, and this was different, Harry, placed not in the kitchen, but in the living room, visible through the front window in a low chair with a wooden tray across its arms. He was playing with something, a cup, or a small block. His hands moved with the deliberate concentration of a child, learning what his fingers could be made to do. Petunia came in twice in the next hour and a half. The first time she set something on the tray and left. The second time she said something, McGonagall could not hear the words through the glass, but the shape of Petunia's mouth was not the curt functional silence of November. It was not warmth. It was closer to the absent narration one offered a pet, the running commentary of a person who had remembered, provisionally, that presence required acknowledgement. Harry did not look up. Dudley was brought downstairs at 9:30, toddling into the living room ahead of Petunia with the proprietorial certainty of a child who understood the house to be his. He was approaching 2 years old now and solidly built, blonde, still largely indifferent to Harry as anything other than an occasional fixture of the floor. He sat down with his own things on the far side of the room. There was no malice in it. There was also no particular curiosity, but the distance between them was floor space rather than a closed door. McGonagall recorded it. She stayed until noon, which was long enough to see Petunia bring Harry into the kitchen for his midday meal and set him in the high chair by the window rather than the corner. Long enough to see Petunia wipe his face afterward with the same brisk efficiency she applied to Dudley's. Long enough to see Harry, when Petunia turned away, press both palms flat against the high chair tray and push himself upright with his arms and then lower himself back down, testing what his body could do without being watched. He didn't cry once in the 5 hours she observed. She thought about what Fig had said in the park. She thought about what the absence of crying described about a child 19 months into his life at Privet Drive. And then she stopped thinking about it because she was in a cat's body on a garden wall and there was no use for that kind of thinking here. What she could say when she wrote to the counselor was that the measurable indicators had shifted. Consistent placement in shared living space. Verbal acknowledgement, however sparse. No evidence of direct harm. The cupboard continued. She had confirmed that by mid-morning, reading Petunia's path through the house. But the hours outside it were longer than they had been in December. Something had changed in the Dursleys' calibration of what they could get away with. And that change was not an accident, and it was not Dumbledore's blood magic. Blood magic held Harry to the house. It did not tell Petunia to speak to him. The walk back to the concealment point took her along the edge of Fig's street. She did not slow. Fig's January letter had already arrived at Hogwarts by Muggle post, the small, neat handwriting, the oblique register, and had told her that Harry was beginning to walk independently over short distances, that Petunia had taken him to the park twice since December, that his vocabulary consisted of approximately 4 sounds, of which perhaps 2 were words. The February summary would come within the fortnight. There was no need to make contact, and she didn't. She apparated from the concealment point and was back in her office by 2 in the afternoon, and the letter from Dumbledore's office was waiting on her desk. It had been written in his hand, not dictated to a house elf, which meant it was not administrative. It asked, in formal and entirely pleasant language, whether she might spare half an hour on Friday afternoon for a brief conversation. It did not specify a subject. It did not need to. She sent back a single line of confirmation and spent the next 3 days finishing her marking and writing the February report to the counselor. The same oblique register, the same sealed owl, and did not think about what Dumbledore knew. It was not useful to rehearse the conversation before it happened. She had found, over 40 years of working for him, that his openings were rarely what she anticipated, and that her best responses came from listening rather than from prepared positions. Friday afternoon was clear and cold. His office smelled of lemon sherbet and old wood and something slightly warm that she had never been able to identify in 40 years of entering it. Fawkes was on his perch, watching her with the steady amber regard of an animal that had decided she was neither threat nor entertainment, simply a recurring event. Dumbledore offered her tea. She accepted it. They observed the small rituals of professional courtesy because they were both people who understood that rituals served a function independent of the feelings beneath them. He said, "I understand you've been in correspondence with members of the board's welfare subcommittee." She said, "I correspond regularly with board members on a range of institutional matters. It's part of my role." "Of course." A pause. He turned his teacup once on its saucer. "I've become aware that the subcommittee has established a direct reporting requirement with Mrs. Fig." "I'm aware of the protocol, yes." "You were aware before I was," Dumbledore said. Not an accusation. An observation placed on the table between them, where they could both look at it. "The subcommittee established the protocol through its own administrative authority," McGonagall said. "The notification went through standard board correspondence. I had no special access to its timing." This was true. She allowed it to be true without elaborating on the meetings that had preceded it. Dumbledore looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she had come to associate with him during this period. Not anger, because he rarely displayed anger directly, but something underneath patience. The effort of patience rather than patience itself. "Arabella has been an extraordinarily reliable presence on that street," he said. "She has managed a difficult situation with genuine care for the child. I would be very sorry if competing institutional claims made her position untenable. I would be very sorry if anyone managing a difficult situation were prevented from reporting fully on what they observed," McGonagall said. The board's protocol seems designed to ensure they aren't. The room was quiet. Fawkes ruffled once and was still. Minerva. He said it in the way that he sometimes did, not as a form of address but as a kind of appeal, the name used where an argument would have failed. I have protected that child with everything at my disposal. I am continuing to protect him. I understand that you have concerns about the conditions of that protection, and I do not dismiss them. I know you don't dismiss them, she said. You have simply decided they are outweighed. Yes. And I have decided, she said, that it is not my function as deputy headmistress to take your word for that weighing. I have reported what I observed through the appropriate institutional channel. I have continued to exercise the oversight responsibilities this institution provides for. I have not acted outside my authority. There it was. The thing they had not said to each other since November, now said plainly and without heat in the afternoon light of his office with the tea cooling between them. Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. When he spoke again, the expression had settled into something harder to read. I want you to understand, he said, that if the arrangement at Privet Drive is destabilized by institutional pressure, if the Dursleys become hostile rather than merely reluctant, the consequences will fall on Harry. Not on the board, not on Mrs. Figg, on Harry. I understand that, McGonagall said. It is one reason I have confined myself to observation and reporting rather than intervention. And yet the effect of that observation and reporting is that a child is receiving marginally better care than he was in November, she said. I have weighed that against your concern. I have reached a different conclusion. She met his eyes when she said it and did not look away. And he did not look away either, and there was the conversation, fully visible between them for the first time. They finished their tea. They observed the courtesies of leave-taking. She thanked him for the meeting. He said warmly that she was always welcome. Walking back down the corridor, she did not feel that she had won anything. She had not expected to. What had happened in that room was the formalization of something that had been true since November, that the easy authority of his oversight and her deference to it was gone, replaced by something that required active maintenance from both of them, and that would continue to require it for as long as Harry Potter remained on Privet Drive. She had stood inside it and not flinched, which was not a victory, but was a different thing than a defeat. The ledger entry that evening was brief, the observation notes, the improvements documented, the meeting, its substance rendered in 3 factual sentences, and then, at the bottom, a line she hadn't planned. He said the consequences will fall on Harry. She wrote it without comment and closed the book. The final report took her 4 evenings to write. Not because the facts were difficult to assemble. She had the ledger, the counselor's letters, her own field notes in the small cramped hand she used for observations she had no intention of sharing, but because a document of this kind required a particular quality of restraint that did not come naturally when the subject was a child who had spent 18 months in a house that did not want him. She wrote drafts and set them aside. She excised 2 paragraphs that were accurate and inadmissible, because accuracy in service of grievance was still grievance, and a grievance was not what she was submitting. She was submitting a record. What the record showed stated plainly. Harry Potter had arrived at number 4, Privet Drive, on the night of October 31st, 1981, as an infant of 15 months, placed without prior arrangement or consent, into the care of relatives who had received no preparation, no support, and no instruction. His initial conditions had included confinement in an unlit cupboard of approximately 12 cubic feet, feeding intervals of 4 to 6 hours without response to interim distress, and total absence of verbal engagement. These conditions had persisted without material change through November 1981. From December 1981 onward, under the diffuse pressure of institutional correspondence, observable external monitoring, and the Dursleys' awareness that their arrangement was not invisible, Harry's daytime conditions had improved incrementally. By February 1982, he was spending the majority of waking hours in shared living space, receiving sparse but consistent verbal acknowledgement, and developing physically and developmentally within normal range for his age, insofar as an observer with a cat's senses and a neighbor's monthly summaries could assess. The cupboard remained his sleeping quarters. She wrote that sentence and did not add anything to it. The assessment section was shorter than the record. She had thought it might be longer. But by the time she arrived at it, on the fourth evening with a cold cup of tea at her elbow and the castle entirely quiet, she found there was not much to say that the record did not already say. Harry Potter was physically surviving. He was developing. He was not receiving adequate emotional care, and there was no mechanism available to compel it. The blood protection magic was real, was irreplaceable, and was the governing constraint. She had verified it. She understood it. She was not challenging it. What she was challenging, and had been challenging since November 1981, was the proposition that irreplaceable protection and institutional accountability were mutually exclusive. They were not. The last 14 months had demonstrated they were not. The modest improvements in Harry's daily conditions had not dissolved Lily Potter's charm. Petunia Dursley remained his guardian. The house remained his residence. The magic held. What had also changed was that the magical world now knew his name and situation, that a clerk's record existed in a London office with institutional weight behind it, and that this knowledge had altered the Dursleys' behavior in the only direction behavior could be altered from outside, through the persistent, impersonal pressure of being observed. The recommendation was 2 sentences. The board should establish permanent, formal oversight protocols for all students placed outside magical households, beginning with Harry Potter's case and extending forward. The protocols should include quarterly reporting from designated observers, mandatory board review, and explicit authority to document and demand changes in placement conditions if physical harm was recorded. She signed it, sealed it, and sent it the following morning. The board's vote occurred in March, 3 weeks after the report arrived. She was not present. It was not the kind of vote that required her presence. Her function had been to submit the evidence. The counselor's function was to move the motion. The board's function was to count itself. The result came to her by owl the same afternoon. The protocol had passed with 11 votes in favor, 1 abstention, no dissent. The single abstention was not the member she would have predicted, which told her something about how the preceding months had shifted the internal weather of that room. The formal document from the clerk's office arrived a week later. It was 3 pages in the dense, careful language of administrative resolutions, and it established, in language that would persist in the board's records indefinitely, that the magical world had a formal obligation to monitor and document the welfare of children in its care who resided in non-magical households. It named Harry Potter as the initial case to which the protocol applied. It named the board's welfare subcommittee as the supervising body. It did not name McGonagall or Fig or the counselor. It did not need to. She filed it in the back of the private ledger, behind her own observations, and wrote nothing further that evening. She and Dumbledore did not discuss it. There was not a conversation in which they decided not to discuss it. There was simply the increasing precision of their professional interactions, the clean lines of formal address, where there had once been the comfortable illegibility of long familiarity. He sent her administrative correspondence through the inter-office channel, rather than walking it down himself. She responded through the same. They attended the same meetings, maintained the same courtesies, and both of them understood that the thing between them was not absence but weight. The accumulated weight of what had been said in his office in November, in February, and of what had not been said in any of the months between, and would not be said now. She had expected to find this harder. The loss of it, the warmth of his regard, the particular pleasure of working alongside someone whose intelligence matched yours and who had, for many years, trusted your judgment as you trusted his. She had expected grief and found instead something steadier. Not satisfaction, not quite peace. The condition of a person who had made a decision that cost something real and had discovered, on the other side of it, that they remained themselves. She trusted her own judgment. She had always known she did. What the last 18 months had told her was that she had, for a long time, outsourced it. Spring came to Privet Drive by increments. The ornamental gardens along the street showed the first blunt growth in early April, and by May, the hedgerows were thick enough that the wall at number 4 felt genuinely sheltered, and the garden itself had the mild, slightly damp warmth of an English spring that had remembered its function after a long administrative winter. She came on a Saturday in late May, 1983. Harry was 2 years and 9 months old. She had not been on the wall since February, and the misdirection charms at the approach paths had been modified again, subtler now, more layered, the kind of adjustment that required sustained attention and revision. She moved through them and settled into position by 9:30. He was in the garden. Not the front garden, the back, visible from the alley side through a gap in the hedge that the spring growth had not yet closed. Petunia was hanging washing, and Harry was on the grass, which was a fact that required a moment's adjustment because the grass was where he was, and she had not observed him in the garden before. He was not unattended. Petunia turned at intervals, registered him, continued. But he was moving freely, which he had not been in November, or December, or February. He walked without holding on to anything now, a toddler's slight forward lean, and he had found something in the grass, a stick or a stone she couldn't determine from distance, and was examining it with the total absorption of a child for whom the external world remained largely novel. He looked, in the physical fact of him, entirely ordinary, brown hair ruffled up at the back, a blue jumper a size too large, muddy knees. He was talking to himself, or to the object. She could hear the sound of it but not the words, in the running commentary of a child who had not yet learned that narration required an audience. She stayed very still. The thing she had known for some time in the abstract was present to her now with a different quality. He did not know she was here. He did not know she had ever been here. He had no sense of the report, or the vote, or the letters, or the park bench in February, or any of the mechanisms that had been constructed, carefully and at cost, around the bare fact of his life on this street. He simply existed, as children did, inside whatever the present moment was giving him. He would go to Hogwarts in 1991. He would arrive knowing nothing, and the world that had been arguing about him for 10 years would see him for the first time as a student rather than a symbol, and that would be its own crisis with its own shape. She would not be able to protect him from it. Blood magic did not cover what was coming. Nothing she had filed, or voted through, or confirmed in a clerk's record reached that far. What it reached was this. The year he arrived, a welfare monitoring protocol would already exist in the board's institutional record. It would have been in place for nearly a decade. It would be ordinary, not a special provision for a special case, but standard practice, applied to every child in a non-magical household, subject to quarterly review, supported by documentation. He would not be invisible. The magical world would have been formally obligated to see him, in writing, for 9 years before he walked through the castle's doors. It was not enough. She was clear-eyed enough to know it was not enough. The cupboard was still there. The Dursleys were still who they were. The boy who would come to Hogwarts in 8 years would carry whatever those years had made of him, and some of it would be hard to carry, and there was a limit to what institutional documents could do about the texture of a childhood. But it was a permanent structure. It was the kind of thing that outlasted the person who built it, that did not require her to be alive and watching for it to continue functioning. She had not been able to give Harry Potter a different family, or a different house, or a different beginning. What she had been able to do was ensure that the magical world's tendency to leave difficult truths in the care of a single powerful man who weighed them privately and acted on his own conclusions, that tendency now had a formal counterweight. Small, institutional, unglamorous, permanent. He found something else in the grass. He held it up, examining it against the light. She watched him, and the morning was mild, and the hedge smelled of new growth, and Petunia turned from the washing line and said his name, flatly, functionally, the voice of a woman reminding a child that he existed rather than welcoming him into anything. But his name, spoken aloud, in the open air of a garden he was allowed to be in. McGonagall remained on the wall until he went inside. Then she descended and crossed the alley and walked back to the concealment point.